Hey guys, welcome back to Daily Kaylee. Today's episode is number 5 in the Daily Kaylee 13 Days of Halloween series. So today, if you have seen American Horror Story Hotel, you know that the Hotel Cortez was designed and owned by a character by the name of James March, who was played by Evan Peters. What you might not know is that James March was based on a real person by the name of H. Holmes. And in the series, Mr. March dies in the hotel after murdering his residents in their rooms. This is once again inspired by H. Holmes. If you want to hear more about H. Holmes, stay tuned. Alright, so H. Holmes, his real name was Herman Webster Mudgett, but he went by Dr. Henry Howard Holmes for whatever reason. He was born on May 16th, 1861, and he died May 7th, 1896. The most interesting thing about this case is that he confessed to 27 murders. They suspected that he killed as many as 200 people, but he was only ever convicted of one murder. All of his victims were killed in a building that he had multiple uses for. He owned this building, and it was called the World's Fair Hotel, informally known as the Murder Castle. He was also a con artist, and he had more than 50 lawsuits in Chicago alone, so you can see what kind of person he was. He was executed on May 7th, 1896, which was 9 days before his 35th birthday. Alright, so a little background on Holmes. He was born in New Hampshire, and his family was actually descended from the first English settlers in the area. He was the third born. He had an older sister and an older brother. And he also had a younger brother and a younger sister. They owned a farm, and he would work for his dad. He would either work on the farm, he would work as a trader for his parents, or he would just be a house painter around the neighborhood. There's obviously no eyewitness accounts of this because it was in the fucking 1800s. But in present day, and over the years, they've tried to fit Holmes into patterns that you can find in modern serial killers. And they predict that Holmes was the type of person who would have tortured animals. And they think that this could have come about by an abusive father. Once again, they have no idea, but we'll see. He graduated from academy at 16, and he actually took a few teaching jobs around town. On July 4th, 1878, he married his wife Clara, and they had a son, Robert. He was born on February 3rd, 1880. As an adult, he became a public accountant, and he actually moved to Orlando, Florida, and became a city manager. At 18, he enrolled in the University of Vermont, but he didn't like school, and he left after a year. In 1882, he enrolled in the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery. He graduated 2 years later in June of 1884 and passed all of his exams. While he was enrolled in school there, he worked in the anatomy lab. Then he worked under the chief anatomy instructor. Before he went to medical school, while he was in New Hampshire, he was an apprentice for a doctor named Nahum White. And this doctor was a huge advocate of human dissection. This is not as important, but it's just a really creepy fact. Whenever Holmes was finally suspected of murder, he claimed that the only crime he'd ever committed was committing insurance fraud for money. However, he admitted to using dead bodies to make fraudulent life insurance claims several times while he was in college and working under this doctor. So he and Clara lived with housemates in this time, and they actually described him as treating her very violently. And in 1884, right before he graduated, she actually moved back to New Hampshire and was pretty much like, fuck this, like, we're not doing this, I'm done. And later on, she actually wrote that she had no contact with him after this. She knew very little about his life after leaving like that. He moved to New York, and after he moved there was a rumor spreading that he had been seen with a little boy who later disappeared. Holmes claimed that he went back to his home in Massachusetts and that he did nothing to him. However, he quickly left town after this rumor started, and because of this, no investigation ever took place. After leaving New York, he moved to Philadelphia, and he got a job as a keeper at Norristown State Hospital, but he quit after a few days. It wasn't for him. After this, he took a position at a drugstore in Philadelphia. However, a little boy actually died after taking medicine that was purchased at the store. He once again denied any involvement in the child's death, but he did immediately leave the city once again. After this is when he moved to Chicago. And right before he moved there, he changed his name officially to Henry Howard Holmes. And apparently he did so that he could avoid being exposed by any victims of previous scams that he had pulled off. It was after he was arrested that he confessed to the 27 murders. But while he was confessing, he claimed that he killed his former medical school classmate, Dr. Robert Leacock, in 1886, and he said it was for insurance money. But Robert actually died in Canada on October 5th, 1889. So it was just a super weird confession to make, and police had no idea why he would have confessed to a murder that he literally did not commit, and that this man was not even dead. However, in late 1886, while he was still married to Clara legally, Holmes married Myrta Belknap in Minnesota. He filed for divorce from Clara a few weeks after marrying Myrta, and he said that it was because of infidelity on Clara's part, which wasn't true. He couldn't prove that these claims were true, so the lawsuit pretty much went nowhere. And paperwork that they can find from this lawsuit seems that she was probably never even informed of it. She probably had no idea that he was even trying to divorce her. And, of course, the divorce was never finalized. Holmes had a daughter with Myrta, and her name was Lucy, and she was born on July 4th, 1889, in Chicago. 5 years later, Holmes married again Georgiana Yoke on January 17th, 1894 in Denver, Colorado, while he was still married to both of the other women. I guess the legal system did not give a fuck in the 1800s. Holmes arrived in Chicago in August of 1886, and that's when he began using the name H.H. Holmes. He came across the drugstore, which was owned by Elizabeth S. Holton, and Holton gave him a job. He was a hardworking employee, and he eventually bought her store. There's a huge myth that Holmes killed both Dr. Holton and her husband. However, that's not true, and they actually survived well into the 20th century, so they're all good. Holmes then purchased an empty lot that was right across from the drugstore, and construction began in 1887 for a 2-story building. He intended for this building to be multi-purpose, so he was going to have apartments on the second floor and a few retail spaces, which would include a new drugstore. However, Holmes declined to pay the architects or the steel company, and they sued him in 1898. In 1892, he added the third floor, and he told investors that he intended to use it as a hotel during the upcoming World's Columbian Exposition. The World's Columbian Exposition was pretty much just like a fair held in Chicago to celebrate the anniversary of Christopher Columbus arriving in the New World. However, the hotel portion was never completed, and the furniture company, when they came to repossess the materials that he didn't pay them for, they found hidden rooms and passages throughout the whole building. Inside of this building, there were soundproofed rooms, and there were mazes of hallways, and some of them seemed to go nowhere. A lot of the rooms had chutes that would go straight to the basement, and in the basement, Holmes had acid vats, quicklime, and a crematorium ready to dispose of his victims' bodies. Obviously, this search made the news because it was hella creepy, and the investors for the hotel pulled out of the deal. The hotel was actually completely gutted by a fire that was started by an unknown arsonist shortly after Holmes was arrested. It was eventually rebuilt and used as a post office until 1938, which is a super boring way to end the legacy of the hotel, but we'll continue. In 1892, the hotel was somewhat completed, and it had 3 stories and a basement. The first floor was the storefront for the drugstore. The second story had his torture rooms, which had the chute that led to the basement, and then the third floor was just apartment rooms. In 1894, some police officers inspected the hotel while Holmes was gone, and during this inspection, they found that some of the rooms had hinged walls and fake partitions. Some rooms were linked together with secret passageways, and there were also airtight rooms that were connected to pipelines filled with gas, which obviously Holmes was using as a gas chamber. In the basement, he had surgical tables and medical tools, and after he killed his victims and used the chutes to put the bodies in the basement, he would dissect them and sell their organs and their bones, either to the black market or to medical institutions. Holmes's first murder that we know of was his mistress, Julia Smythe, and she was the wife of Ned Connor, who had moved into Holmes's building and began working at his pharmacy's jewelry counter. After Connor found out about the affair with Holmes, he quit his job and moved away, leaving Julia and their daughter Pearl behind. Julia remained at the hotel with Pearl and continued her relationship with Holmes. Julia and Pearl both disappeared on Christmas Eve of 1891, and Holmes later claimed that she had died during an abortion, but what truly happened to them was never confirmed. Another woman that is highly likely to have been murdered by Holmes was Emmeline Cigrande, and she began working in the building in May of 1892 and then disappeared that following December. Another woman by the name of Edna Van Tassel also vanished and is believed to have been one of Holmes's victims. While working in the Chemical Bank building on Dearborn Street, which is in New York, before he moved to Chicago, Holmes met and became close friends with Benjamin Pitezel, and he was a carpenter with a criminal past who was in the same building exhibiting a coal bin that he had invented. Holmes used Pitezel as his right-hand man for several criminal schemes, and a district attorney later described Benjamin as Holmes's tool, like he was a creature that he had created. One-hit wonder actress named Minnie Williams moved to Chicago. Holmes claimed that he met her in an employment office, but there were rumors that he had met her in Boston, which happened years earlier. He offered her a job at the hotel, and she accepted. Holmes somehow persuaded Williams to transfer the deed of her property that she owned in Fort Worth, Texas, to a man by the name of Alexander Bond, which was Holmes, using an alias. I have no fucking idea how he convinced her to do that. But in April of 1893, Williams did indeed transfer it, and Holmes was the notary. He then later signed the deed over to Pitzel, and he gave him the alias Benton T. Lyman. The next month, Holmes and Williams, presenting themselves as man and wife, rented an apartment in Chicago's Lincoln Park. Minnie's sister Annie came to visit, and in July she wrote to her aunt that she planned to accompany Brother Harry to Europe. They didn't have a brother named Harry, and neither Minnie or Annie were seen alive after July 5th, 1893. So, multiple insurance companies were trying to prosecute Holmes for arson, committing insurance fraud, so he left Chicago in July of 1894. He reappeared in Fort Worth, Texas, and he got the property from Minnie Williams that she signed over to him. And here, pretty much, he wanted to construct another murder castle or hotel, just like the one that he had in Chicago. In July of 1894, Holmes was arrested briefly and served a little bit of time for selling mortgaged goods in St. Louis, Missouri. He was bailed out, but while in jail, he struck up a conversation with a convicted outlaw named Marion Hedgepeth, who was serving a 25-year sentence. Holmes came up with a plan to swindle an insurance company out of $10,000 by taking out a policy on himself and then faking his death. $10,000 in today's money would be almost $300,000. Apparently, Holmes promised Hedgepeth a $500 commission in exchange for the name of a lawyer who could actually be trusted. Holmes was then directed to a young St. Louis attorney by the name of Jephthah Howe. Howe was in practice with his older brother, Alfonso, who had no involvement with Holmes or Pitzel or their fraudulent activities. Howe, however, thought that this scheme was brilliant. He thought that Holmes could absolutely pull this off. However, his plan failed when the insurance company was super suspicious of this entire situation, and they refused to pay. So, instead of pressing the matter further with the insurance company, he instead came up with a very similar plan with Pitzel. So, Pitzel agreed to fake his own death so that his wife could collect $10,000 on a life insurance policy. And she was supposed to split this money with Holmes and Howe. The scheme was supposed to take place in Philadelphia, and Pitzel was to set himself up as an inventor under the fake name B.F. Perry, and then he would be killed and disfigured in a lab explosion. Holmes was supposed to find an appropriate cadaver to play the role of Pitzel. Instead, Holmes killed Pitzel by knocking him unconscious with chloroform and then set his body on fire. In his confession, Holmes implied that Pitzel was still alive after he chloroformed him and that the fire killed him. However, forensic evidence shows that the chloroform was administered after Pitzel died. And the insurance company did not know this, so they paid out the $10,000, and pretty much they think that the chloroform was administered in the first place to fake a suicide in case Holmes was ever charged with murder. He collected the payout, and then he went on to manipulate Pitzel's wife into allowing 3 of her 5 children to be in his custody. The oldest daughter and the baby stayed with Mrs. Pitzel. However, Holmes and the 3 children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, traveled through the northern United States and went into Canada. He took Mrs. Pitzel along a parallel route, and this entire time he was using various aliases. She never knew his real name, and she lied to him about her husband's death and claimed that he was hiding in London. And he also lied to her about the true whereabouts of her 3 children that he was in custody of. They were in Detroit, and they were only separated by a few blocks. And she had no idea the entire time. Holmes was staying at another location, away from the children, with his wife, who had no idea any of this was happening. He later confessed to murdering Alice and Nellie by forcing them into a large trunk and locking them inside. He apparently drilled a hole in the lid of a trunk and put the end of a hose through the hole, and the other end of the hose was attached to a gas line. He buried their nude bodies in the cellar of his rental house in Toronto. Frank Geyer. He was a Philadelphia police detective, and he was assigned to investigate Holmes to find the 3 missing children. He found the decomposed bodies of the 2 girls in the cellar of his home. Detective Geyer wrote in his report, "The deeper we dug, the more horrible the odor became, and when we reached the depth of 3 feet, we discovered what appeared to be the bone of the forearm of a human being." After this, Geyer went to Indianapolis, which is where Holmes had been renting a cottage. In Indianapolis, Holmes was reported to have visited a local pharmacy, and this is where he purchased the drugs that he used to kill Howard Pitzel. And there was actually also a repair shop there that he had went to sharpen the knives that he used to chop up his body before he burned it. Howard's teeth and bits of his bone were discovered in the Holmes chimney. Holmes was finally arrested in Boston on November 17, 1894, and he was tracked there from Philadelphia by the Pinkertons. The Pinkertons was like a private security guard and detective agency that was established in the United States in 1850. Pretty much, they were a national detective agency. I mean, it was almost like a private investigator at the time. Anyways, he was held on an outstanding warrant for horse theft in Texas, apparently. The authorities were extremely suspicious of him, and they thought that he was going to try to flee the country with his 3rd wife, who once again knew nothing about any of these murders. After they discovered Alice and Nellie's bodies in the cellar of his rental house, the Chicago police began investigating Holmes's building that he referred to as the Murder Castle in Chicago. Out of all of the creepy ass shit that went down in that building, in that hotel, there was not enough evidence to convict him on anything in Chicago. In October of 1895, Holmes was put on trial for the murder of Benjamin Pitzel, and he was found guilty and sentenced to death. By then, it was obviously evident that he had murdered the children. And following his conviction, he did confess his 27 murders that took place in Chicago, Indianapolis, and Toronto. But once again, some of the people that he confessed to murdering were still alive. He also confessed to 6 attempted murders. He was freaking paid $7,500 in exchange for his confession by a newspaper company, which in today's money is $230,000. Even though his confession was mostly ridiculous and not true. He gave crazy-ass stories about his life that made no sense. He initially claimed that he was innocent, and then later claimed that he was possessed by Satan. While he was in prison writing out his confessions, he mentioned how drastically his facial appearance had apparently changed since he was imprisoned. He described his new appearance as gruesome and taking a satanical cast. He wrote that he was now convinced that after everything he had done, he was beginning to resemble the devil. He also wrote, "I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing. I was born with the evil one standing as my sponsor beside the bed where I was ushered into the world, and he has been with me since." On May 7th, 1896, Holmes was hanged at the Philadelphia County Prison for this murder. Until the moment of his death, he was super calm and almost friendly to everyone. It was super creepy. He literally never showed any signs of fear, anxiety, or depression. Despite being super calm and cool the entire time, he asked for his coffin to be contained in cement and buried 10 feet deep because apparently he was concerned that grave robbers would steal his body and dissect it. While he was hanging, his neck did not break, and he instead strangled to death slowly. He was not pronounced dead until 20 minutes after the fact. On March 7th, 1914, the caretaker of the murder castle, or the hotel in Chicago, on his deathbed, said to reporters of the Chicago Tribune that the mysteries of Holmes Castle would remain unexplained. The caretaker, by the name of Quinlan, had committed suicide, and a note read, "I couldn't sleep." His relatives claimed that he had been haunted for several months and was suffering from hallucinations. This is probably the creepiest part of this entire thing, and it's the most simple. In 2017, there was some weird popular claims that Holmes had escaped his execution, and they actually dug up his body. And because he was contained in cement, in 2017, his body was not decomposed. His clothes were almost perfectly preserved, and his mustache was still intact. And that's the end of the mystery of H.H. Holmes. Let me know what you guys think of this case. Go home and watch American Horror Story Season 5. And let me know, guys. Thank you. I'll see you in a few days. Bye.